I'm building an Admiralty style model in the techniques used by Philip Reed and a handful of others. And this is the one that inspired me. This is Philip Reed's HMS Mordant, and it is the subject of one of his several books that he wrote. The one, How to Build a Navy Board Model, is the process of building this. I got the book about 4 years ago, and slowly it got its hooks into me until, having established that I didn't get on well with kits, having established quite a few things about what skills I actually did have instead of imagined I had, I just felt like going straight onto the thin ice, and I'm building a Navy board model following his style. This is the heart and soul of one of the models that Philip Reed would make. It would be, if you look at all the pizza slices laying in the background, it would be those whose centers are hollowed out and parts of the outer frame removed, glued to others of similar type, gradually progressing into something that looks like an Admiralty board model. And he did it in a small scale, and so am I. So if you have a look here where the center is, that in the early stages, and that even earlier stage back there, are the one and the same. This hollowed out piece was hollowed out, glued to the next one, and then another one hollowed out and glued to it. And then once you've got this type of assembly here, having faired it previously and then taken all the pieces apart, you then go inside and start smoothing it out as one whole unit rather than individual frames and timbers. As I say, it got under my skin, and I've decided to go for it. So that,
Bruce, as this is on the stocks, we're all allowed just to butt in. Can you say what are you using, and what tool did you use to cut the frames?
All right, I'll come to that in just a moment, because I have pictures that cover all that, and at the appropriate moment, I was thinking it would be useful. But to answer the question straightforward, I'm using Swiss pear for all of the hull work, except for the upper works, which will be in lime when I get to them, but that's quite a ways down the road. What was in the picture you just saw from Philip Reed's workshop was Castello. And the milling of the wood is a key part of the construction of this type of ship. And the way he did it and the way I did it are completely different, because we are different people in different workshops at different times. But anybody is going to have the same problems when they come to it. Not problems necessarily, the same issues to overcome if they want it to work. And there's more than one solution. So if you can bear with me, I'll get to the wood and the materials in just a moment. This is HMS Berwick. HMS Berwick was one of the Elizabeth classes. It's a 74 designed by Slade after Bologna. It's very helpful knowing that, because the anatomy of the ship covers many of the constructional details and techniques that I'll be trying to reproduce in a small scale. Even though it was a very similar ship, I know there are differences, and fortunately they seem to be documented well enough that I won't do anything silly, at least not in terms of getting Bologna materials mixed up with Elizabeth class. There were 8 of the Elizabeth class: HMS Elizabeth, Resolution, Cumberland, Berwick, Bombay Castle, Powerful, Defiance, and Swiftshore. And they were made variously at Portsmouth, Deptford, and Blackwall. Oh, and one at Rotherhithe. The Defiance was made at Rotherhithe. The consistency amongst them in their design is one thing that is in my favor, because if I can find a set of drawings or references to one of the others, they all seem to have been quite close to each other on instructions from Slade and the Admiralty at the time, that they were to be not interchangeable. We're not getting to that stage, but he didn't want the shipyards to go off on their tangents and humoring their shipwrights with and letting them indulge themselves. So the information is fairly good from my point of view in that respect. She's got an awful lot of frames that are drawn, and that was a great help in deciding on this one, because here is just about everything I need. There are 29 frame stations drawn there, and there are a further 3 in the drawings that are copied into the Danish archives. Those 3 are not part of the structure that you see here with standard timbers and half timbers forming futtocks and floors, but rather just at the stern end, up where the aft works and the rudder were hanging, etc. There's more information. That also helped me to feel that I was on to the right subject. This is one of the National Maritime Museum's drawings. Each of those is available in a high resolution version, by the way, the drawings that I've just been referring to. And that has been invaluable because I was able to blow them up to such a degree that it was easy to, where I needed to, trace them, etc., and then reduce them back down to size. The one area where the high resolution drawings fail me, unfortunately, was in the stern section of Berwick, and we'll come to that because I was lucky enough to visit the National Maritime Museum and see the original drawings. So upper decks, nothing extraordinary. It's just like other 74s of the time, but each of those is in a position, each of those beams that you see there is in a position that corresponds with the frame sections you've seen, except for a couple, and I was able to dig out what the differences were there. So again, I'm able to say that it was a class that was chosen because of the material available. Now that doesn't look much like HMS Berwick there, but that's what I'm starting with. That is a block of Swiss pear. I have 3 of those. That's the largest one, and that's my bandsaw, and that was before I began work. I have a thin strip setup laid out on that, which I won't go into too much of the milling detail, but there's a certain amount that is necessary to understand, because otherwise you'll wonder why on earth I went to all the trouble to do certain things in certain ways. That gave way to strips. The strips then were at an approximate thickness that I needed. These were about 2.5 to 2.7 millimeters thick, each of them. That is too thick for my purposes, but I didn't know what that final figure would be yet. So that allowed me some leeway when I put them through a sander then. Like this is one of the 2 sanding devices I have set up on a large bench drill. It's remarkably accurate. If I set it at a particular thickness, a particular clearance, and get the speed right on the drive, I was turning out pieces of pear going through it on their second pass, i.e. the second side pass, that they were all within 0.1 millimeter of each other. And this was about a dozen pieces that I tested it on. I felt very confident that I had got the right tool there. And here is a step that isn't normally associated, in my mind at least, with making a model, but this is an absolutely critical step. Each of the frames in the cross sections that you saw earlier represents 4 stations, except for a handful which represented 2. And each of those, if you look at the contract and you look at the side frame drawings, which we have broken down, must be of the same material. We have the contract for the ships. We know what the thicknesses were. But if you divide the number of stations that there are by the pieces, by the length of the finished model, that in theory should tell you how thick each of the pieces should be. But you can't rely on it, because being out by 0.1 millimeter with over 100 of these frames to make, well, you'd be out 10 millimeters or more, because I think it's 127, in fact, in the end. thicknesses I had to take account for. So it had to be done dead accurate. And of course, you can't mass produce your wood until you have that finished figure, but you can't do the test until you've got some wood to test. So what solution I applied was the one that Philip Reed used, and that is try a thickness, glue 10 sections of it together under pressure, as you see there, and then measure them. And if the 10 sections don't match exactly 10 sections on the frame of the scale drawing you're using, too thick or too thin, then your wood is too thick or too thin by a small degree. I did I think it was my sixth attempt at this, and we're talking about variations of 0.1 of a millimeter in the thicknesses before I found the one that I was comfortable with. And it has stood the test so far. As we progress further along, I was able to make some measurements and come up with some reassurance that the thickness was right. But that is the process: glue, press, measure, do it again, do it again. There is no gray area. It's black or white. You've got the right thickness or you don't. So that's what I had to do. Once I had the right thickness established and I'd put them through the sanders, I started cutting them into the sections that were needed to make the frames. The entire process from here on out is counterintuitive. It may be a muddle when I describe it, but the end results worked for Philip Reed and Donald McNary, for example, who won various awards by using this on an even smaller scale. My scale is 1 to 192. It's a 16th inch scale, and that's small enough, I think, for me. Donald McNary won awards by doing it at 384 scale. Same techniques. There's something about the magic that he used, I don't know. But that is the building board. The spine that you see running down the middle is very accurately made. I spent a lot of time and threw several in the bin before I was satisfied with the one that I had. The thickness almost doesn't matter as long as it's consistent, because you're going to make slots in the components that you're putting to slip onto it. So there's no rule, no right or wrong. And I ended up with that being just over 5 millimeters wide. The end piece on this end down here to the screen's right, that's fixed in place, but I've done so with a screw that allows me, should it ever get knocked out of position or I had to make some changes to the way it's the rubber bands and other clamps are done, I could reposition it accurately at 90 degrees. It must be at 90 degrees to the spine, and the upright piece must be a true 90 degrees to the baseboard. The larger piece that you see down here is a solid chunk of mahogany with the same hole, the rebate cut in it that will fit tightly over the spine. Excuse me. And a bit of paste wax was put on it, and everything slides around. That piece that is the mahogany piece will be in various places as the build goes on, because it's only when you get to the very end that all the pieces are on there at any one time. Various subsections will be handled, and you need to be able to move that back and forth. The little cutouts that you see here are for the anticipated rubber bands that I'll be using to tie everything together around here, there, and onto this to keep things in place. I suspect I'm going to end up drilling a few holes behind, down on the left-hand end, behind where the mahogany is now, so that I can put some clamps there that will push the two pieces together. But I can do that if I need it later. I think the rubber bands will do the job, but then again, we'll see. Now, this looks a little bit more like making a model, doesn't it? Here is one of the profile sections that you saw, the frame sections. I printed them up, printed out onto card, pasted onto plastic, and then cut them out. Each of them is numbered and very, very visually distinct, because so many of them in the mid section are similar. I just knew what was going to happen. So I keep them well identified, and all the pieces that are cut I immediately mark up what their section number is, their position on all sides, everything that's visible. So with that in mind, I would lay this out against the nice hard surface here, push my perfectly square pieces of wood that you saw me cutting on the saw earlier. Everything must be 90 degrees. That's very important. And take a stack of them. And I don't know how many people are used to the blue tape method of stacking things and bonding them together, but I'm taking these to the scroll saw, and I am able to do 4 at a time. What you do, and I'm sure I'm telling some people things they already know, but it may be news to others. By putting blue painter's tape, which leaves no residue, it's kind of like a painter's post-it note on a roll, onto each piece. You can then, by the way, the top piece here does have blue tape on the underside of it where they come together. And that only has blue tape on the bottom one here, only has blue tape on the top side, not on the back. By putting super glue, CA, onto those bits of blue tape and lining them up carefully, everything is bonded together sufficiently to go through the process of cutting out en masse. And then when you take them apart, it's only the blue tape that comes off. The CA has never touched the wood if you do it right. I messed up a couple, but I'm glad to say with hindsight that there were only a couple. This is the way that I got them nice and square. That old angle plate, which came from an RAF workshop, I have no idea how old it is, but it is very handy for things like this. Shove all 4 of the pieces together. The one on top has been marked out with the profile. They're now glued together. I've taken them to the scroll saw, and when you cut them, that is the side section that you see. You can just see the division between them where the blue tape is here down at the bottom, and then prise them apart. It's the tape that's coming away from the wood, no glue doing anything to the wood there. And they come apart like an oyster opening. You then have, in the case of the 4 that I just cut, these 4 pieces, which are then butt jointed together to make 2 frame profiles. All will be revealed if you don't know the McNary method. And that is what it looks like when you've got all your profiles for one side stacked up against a backdrop with the profile drawing behind. It's beginning to look like there might be a ship somewhere in the mix. But it's only half a ship, because that side facing me has nothing beyond it except that lump of wood that you see, which I use to line it up with. What you do in order to carry on with the process then, to make it into a ship, is to make a jig like this, which is perfectly square and flat, lay a piece of paper across this, which has non-stick qualities. I used a bit of label paper from a printer, the non-stick paper that goes behind it. You then put 2 of those pieces together against the hard straight edge at the top, up against the square for reference on the left-hand side, and butt joint them with CA. Then you have one of these. A quick light sanding to make sure that there's no lumps or bumps where the seam is, because that becomes important later. And they begin to pile up. Now, if you remember what I said about the building board, you'll notice as you look at this, there's no facility for laying them onto the spine yet. That's the next stage, and this is where all the pieces start to come together, of keeping right angles and nice straight surfaces together, because you need a jig like this and a good saw. That's a Burns saw, which is the best. I'm very delighted to have one, which I got from a deceased model maker's estate. I made up the arm that you see here with the adjustable stop at this end. This is where the blade is over this area, and this piece that you see here, this fixture, is 2 pieces of sapele wood. That is a piece of wood the same thickness as all of the frames that I am bringing together. There's a large gap here, and that thumb screw goes into a threaded insert on this side that pulls everything together. Now, this stop on the extreme left limits the movement in that direction, and the table fence that comes with the saw limits the movement in the other, where it's set. You drop the frame into that slot there, make sure that it's firmly down and square, and then you can slide it forward across the blade, which is set to the exact height that's needed. And no more. That's the saw, the burn saw allows that form of accuracy. And I have absolute admiration for anybody that does it without a device like this. I know that Donald McNary used to do it by hand, individually. Like I said before, a touch of magic. So this is the frame in operation. Extreme movement to the right, the blade touched up against it. There's my center line for visual referencing. You saw that the other side had the stop on the crossbar. Here's a frame in place. You can just see the blade sticking up behind here. Before I slide everything forward, this is all the way over to the left. So that blade is going to appear through right there. And the result is a good snug fit. I've done it, even though there are 127 sections, I've had to do about 200 of these pieces, and they are all a perfect fit. That jig has worked exactly as I was hoping it would every time. And that's how we proceed from here. The next thing that has to be done in order to make it into something that looks like an Admiralty board model, though, is to start getting some space between the pieces that you just made, because they represent exactly half of the stations and frames in the real thing that we're going to reproduce as a model. So those little lumps there are just bits of scrap of the same thickness, so that when these go back onto the frame next time, they will be separated by the exact correct amount. And you can see from the small group that's gathered together here, the spaces have appeared. Those are fitted with the spacers and tucked up against each other. Those over here and those in the foreground haven't had the scraps fitted to them yet. We're rapidly approaching the thin ice. This is the next step. Now that is a scrap one. That's one that I rejected because I wasn't quite happy with the profile that I had made, but I'm using this as practice because the next steps are the ones that frankly make or break everything that you've done so far. That spacer that you see sticking out there is the right thickness. That line that I have made there is one that I've had to estimate, and I'll just go back one shot. If you can imagine that there is no line on this now, there is no point of reference, and there's no way of accurately taking the drawing measurements to these now without doing them one by one. Well, I need to cheat because I need to know where to put that line, because that line, you can't see it there, I don't think. That line is where you put this piece, and this piece, followed by the ones that are going to go here, with a bit of seccotine so that it can be prized apart, there and there, specifically there and there, will allow me to put those pieces on, which then means I can turn this piece over, cut away all the excess. Those will be used on the next one up there. All the excess, make the frame now a double, as in the terminology that Philip Reed used, which is 2 frames set side by side. When we're through with all this, because the seccotine, which is able to be prized apart, is in a part here at this junction of the wood, and that corner there, that piece is going to stay when this piece is cut away on the saw, that same burned saw that you saw earlier. And as that is cut away, and this bit up here and this bit here stay because the seccotine is holding them in place, we then have, with this trimmed to the outside shape that is easy to do because, as you saw there, we have this larger original piece to use as a guide. We then cut away the other bits on the top. You begin to expose the areas of the frame that would be open in the Admiralty model. And if you don't have this line in the right place, which varies with each of the frame sections, then you're going to not have a straight line on the finished model. And it has to be a line that makes sense as far as the drawings of the ship and the whole form are concerned. So my solution, and the reason I said we're headed for thin ice on this, and when everything is to go right back to the beginning. You saw that half model effect where everything was lined up and the pieces began to look like a ship. I'm going to put some more of that magical blue tape across it, and when I'm satisfied that I have the line that I want, I will mark the edge, the exposed edge of each one. Then they need to be taken off the building board. A line perfectly parallel to the baseboard has to be drawn across, as you saw there, that white line that goes across. And that's achieved by using that same jig that was used to put the to butt joint the pieces together, to put the two halves together to make a whole. If you put the piece like this in that and then use a nice little right angle piece like you have down here, the bit sticking out, you can find that straight line. Mark it in and go through that. This is why it's thin ice. If I get that wrong, I won't have a straight line. And if I don't have a straight line, I'll be a very sad model builder about that. But the process works. This is a test piece. I haven't done it in anger because this one's going in the bin when I'm through with it. It's one of the rejects. And who knows what I'll learn about how to do it. I have to be able to do them one at a time, as there is no shortcut that I've been able to find. But the trickiest bit of all is getting that bit of seccotine in the right spot exactly, because that stays, but the area from there down to there will be cut away on the piece that we're gluing to it. So there needs to be no glue there. When the saw goes through, that has to be able to fall out, but it has to be held, which is why there has to be glue here. Now this is held, this piece here is held in much the same way, having calculated where to put the bits and bobs. If we go to the rear, I went to the National Maritime Museum to look at the original drawings, because the one that wasn't in high res was the one that had the stern. For copyright reasons, I can't use the photographs that I took, but this one has been modified enough that I can use it. That is the stern of Berwick. And I'm getting in touch with the Berwick upon Tweed Historical Society, because there are a couple of things in here that even a fairly casual internet search tells me are peculiar to Berwick in the 18th century. These dogs, you can see one here. This is my colorization, by the way, in case anybody had any doubts about what they did in the 18th century when these plans were made. This dog here and this dog here may be representations, as they're not commonly put on the sterns of warships, of something that was peculiar to the area around Berwick at that time. There was a breed of dog. There's no known illustration of it. There are images of the dogs that were bred from that breed. And I'm wondering if that's what I'm looking at, is perhaps the only illustration of the dog known as the the Berwick burr at that time. It's very possible, because if you come down into this corner here, you'll see that I have colored in a bird which is holding a snake in its beak. And that is definitely tied to Berwick at that time. That's a cormorant, and the snake that it's holding and that is wrapped around it was part of symbolism that was used in other things, a couple of the stately homes that were around that area. And I'd like to find out what the rest of the story is, because even though I know they fit into the picture, I don't know where the piece fits into the puzzle, just that it's in there somewhere. So with those two things, the dogs and the cormorants, to start the conversations, I'm rather hoping that I'll find out some more things about the decorations that I can't recognize when I'm looking at them, and that perhaps have some significance. For example, these fellows here on either side, there's a mirroring one here. He doesn't exactly look like any British soldier, any English soldier. What he looks like is a Roman soldier. And it was in that area that various problems were sorted out between the occupying Romans and the locals. I'd like to find out if there's some significance to that. But it will be on the word of the local historical society that I act. I won't make too many more assumptions, other than, again, saying that I believe they fit in. I just don't know where. Incidentally, there's a second pair of cormorants besides the ones holding the snakes just here. That is a cormorant, and it has its mate over here somewhere. And I've speculated on the color of the blue, but I believe that that is one of the colors that was used at that time for exactly that purpose. This is the king. That is the crown that is being held up there. This angelic creature here and her friend without wings over here, they're probably not significant in local lore, but they do fit in. It's this guy, though, that keeps on drawing my attention, because he looks very much like Pan. And what Pan is doing on the stern of a warship of that time, I'd be very interested in finding out if it is Pan, and if he is there, why is he there? So I'm going to start the stern decorations before I get anywhere near ready to put them on, because I'm fairly certain that I've got a year's work to do in the stern alone. So I'll mock it up and then I'll start on it. The materials throughout this 192nd scale build will be pearwood for the Swiss pear for the bulk of the items that you've just seen, lime for the upper section, which is in the Philip Reed style and the Donald McNary school of thought, a solid block that is then hollowed out, carved to shape, etc. And when the pieces are all removed from the spine for the last time, that are the lower part, you cut away the top. Having hollowed them out, you then cut away the top and mate it up to the block of wood that is then carved away. I'm putting an intermediary piece of wood in between, a board. And I'm hoping to have the stern in such a condition that I will be able to just offer it up and fair to fit the stern, rather than trying to work on the finished model or wait until I get to that stage to start on it. The other materials that will be used in it will be cherry wood for some of the beams. I'll be doing armament that will probably be out of holly. And I have some sycamore if I need it for a little bit of strength in different places. But that's my Berwick at the moment.